So hello everybody, welcome to this panel. We're here to talk about security and stability in the Black Sea region and in the Balkans, particularly perhaps the Western Balkans. We have a really great panel of experts and officials and practitioners actually to talk about these issues. But before we start, I just would like to give, very shortly, a slight background picture. I mean, for me, up until Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, sort of Black Sea security had become, the EU had become rather complacent on the issues of security in this region. I think there was a sort of misplaced belief that a war would never return to Europe. So there was no need to really double down on efforts to reinforce security and stability of parts of that region. This is why we ended up with grey zones, as I call them, Moldova, Ukraine, and even in Georgia. Obviously, when it comes to the Western Balkans, it's a different story because there was a commitment made 2 decades ago in Thessaloniki. Back in those days, the integration of that region was seen as a strategic priority. Unfortunately, that ran out of speed, and the integration of the Western Balkans had basically been put on the back burner, at least in my opinion, which allowed sort of other external actors, malign actors, to intercede into the region. And quite comically, it seems to me that Europe's security was seen increasingly as being guaranteed by being able to pipe more and more Russian fossil fuels, among other things, into the continent. So you could say there was a lot of short-sighted decisions that were taken, but unfortunately it only took this disgusting war for them to wake up. So we're at what we call now this watershed moment. So I'd like now to turn to our first speaker, who's actually online, Ian Lesser, who's Vice President of the German Marshall Fund, and ask him, do you think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine exposed the total failure of transatlantic policies, not only towards Russia, but the wider Black Sea region? And also, have the necessary lessons actually been properly learned? Because we still hear people calling for a negotiated settlement to the war. So what's your take on that?
Well, Amanda, thank you very much. It's very good to be with you, and I'm very sorry I'm not there in person, but at least we're connected this way. Obviously these are very big questions. I think, to answer them in part, I think we had gotten rather complacent. Obviously there were voices with different views, but we got rather complacent about the risks of Russian revanchism and aggression in its neighborhood and even beyond. We can look at places like Africa, but that's not our subject today. I think in part this was because we were still operating with ideas about deterrence that we'd inherited from the Cold War. And of course there were huge risks at that time. But there was also a huge logic to the relationship, which evolved over decades. And I think in the end, we had failed to reckon with the role of ruthlessness, if I could put it that way, in deterrence and the difficulty of deterring ruthless behavior when it's highly personalized and based on less rational sort of calculus. Anyway, that's what we're facing, and we're facing it still, even in the context of what is for perhaps Ukraine's Western partners a limited war, although it's surely not limited from the point of view of those on the ground in Ukraine. And this risk assessment, that would be my second point in terms of learning lessons. Well, one of the lessons we actually learned during the Cold War, which we in some ways lost, is the fact that you need, even in those very difficult kinds of conditions, to have a basic understanding about stability, about what is stabilizing, what is not, where the risks come from. And as the longer this conflict goes on, and it shows no sign of ending anytime soon, the accumulated risk of something simply going wrong, whether it's in the Black Sea, potentially in the Balkans, but in the Black Sea and the Baltic and other areas we're not necessarily focused on today, is growing. And that could involve escalation in the context of the current war, or it could simply be, it could also involve escalation with other NATO allies. And there are many possibilities for that in the maritime space, in the air, and in other respects. I think that's a very, very critical risk we need to reckon with. Where does that leave us? I mean, I think we're going to actually have much more focus on how to assure maritime communications in the Black Sea in the future. This is not easy to do. There will be further risks involved in trying to do that, but I think it's absolutely essential for all sorts of reasons. And finally, just in terms of the wider region, I think what we have experienced in the last few years clearly underscores what many people in the region were telling us, especially in the Western Balkans, for many years, that unfinished business in terms of the Euro-Atlantic integration of the Western Balkans and other countries holds its own risks, especially in a time of conflict. But I'm happy to pick up on anything else.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And I'd like to pick up on what you just said about some individual countries that for actually many years have been flagging the need to strengthen security and do more in the region, particularly in terms of Euro-Atlantic integration. And for this, I would like to turn to Romania's ambassador here in Cyprus, Mr. Dan Mihalace, and I hope I did not badly pronounce that. I mean, Romania has for many, many years been calling for strengthened mechanisms for the Black Sea. I know this because I've been working on the topic for a very long time, but unfortunately your voice, along with the other countries, let's say on the eastern flank, had been shut down, which in retrospect turned out to be a major error. So I would like to ask you, I mean, how do you see now, what should be the steps now to strengthen the security in the Black Sea? I mean, obviously now it's a hell of a lot more difficult than it was, let's say, 1.5 years ago. I mean, Russia at that point had already tried to turn it into a black lake and its own military base on Crimea. This situation has now deteriorated. But are we past the point of no return when it comes to pushing back and having a greater, let's say, NATO or transatlantic presence in terms of Black Sea security?
Hello, everybody. Thank you. I hope it works. You are right, because if now we regard the entire strategic picture, we will see that on the eastern flank, the Black Sea is practically the weakest point. We have enhanced presence in the Baltic Sea, the Mediterranean, which remains a strong point for, let's say, for NATO. But the Black Sea remains something like a Cinderella of the eastern flank, like a weak point of security, also due to the characteristics of the region, but also that there was no enough sensitivity to understand how to manage the situation in this area. And we can find various explanations, including the fact that there is a clear division between old and new Europe. Old Europe is less sensitive to the eastern flank and to the worries of the countries on the eastern flank, then we believe that as new NATO and European Union members. But I think that we can see in the last time a very, very positive development, and I will mention the approval by the American Senate of an act on the 27th July. I will read it because I want to quote it very correctly, the National Defense Authorization Act, which includes the Baltic Sea Security Act through an amendment introduced by two senators, Mitt Romney and Jean Sheehan. So this act will come into the debate in the House of Representatives in this autumn, and it's the first strong signal which is delivered that the Black Sea security is important for NATO alliance and NATO members. This I would say it's a very positive development, which means that the concerns about what will happen to the Black Sea begin to be acknowledged and okay, we have to think for the future about the developments that will follow, and they are very linked with what will happen with the conflict in Ukraine, because regarding various scenarios of ending this conflict, also these scenarios will shape the attitudes and the problematic of the Black Sea. I believe that it is important that we have an increased military presence of NATO in the Black Sea, and that we will have to design, and I know that some of the decision makers are thinking about this sort of task force, fleet, with some characteristic that will provide the necessary defense. The Black Sea will be important in the future because various actors are looking to the Black Sea. And it's not only about Russia, which had a historical interest in the, and it goes through the Russian history in despite of the nature of the political regime for centuries. But now it's also China, who will regard the Black Sea with interest, because the design of the routes that China imagines as a economic way are going to the Black Sea. It's also Iran, who can find in the Black Sea door for its policies. And of course, we are talking here also about the attitude that Turkey will, and the policy that Turkey will encourage, support, and pursue towards Black Sea, towards Russia, towards NATO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And you're correct when you say there's multiple actors engaged in the Black Sea and new global influences coming into the Black Sea. But I still think it's fair to say that the biggest challenge at the moment within the Black Sea remains Russia's attempt to blockade the Black Sea. I mean, no other country filled the Black Sea with landmines and other sorts of munitions. So this is obviously going to be one of the key challenges, at least in the short term. I mean, the blockade has also, as we all know, prevented Ukraine to a large degree to get its grain and other agricultural exports out of the Black Sea, which has had this huge impact on global food security. So I'd like to turn to you now, Julia Kazdobina, who is a senior fellow at the Ukrainian Prism, a think tank in Ukraine, and a long-time expert on the region. I mean, to your mind, what should be the priority now when it comes to improving Black Sea security? How can peace be restored the quickest way?
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much for the question. Of course, just as you mentioned, if we paid attention to this at least several years before, the situation would have been a lot easier, but what we're facing now is Russia, who basically militarized the Crimean Peninsula, and Crimean Peninsula allows it to have this kind of central part of the Black Sea and move a lot closer to Ukrainian shores and also to the shores of other NATO countries in the region. And Ukraine, I mean, the Ukrainian objective at this point is, and we believe that the only way to restore peace in the Black Sea region is to liberate Crimea from the Russian occupation, and the maximal goal, of course, is also strip Russia of the ability to continue committing aggression in the Black Sea region. We understand that this is really a maximal agenda, and most likely it's not achievable in the short term, but we believe that this should be a strategic goal that we should be pursuing, and the reason for that being, just like as Amanda mentioned in the beginning, the peaceful negotiated settlement most likely is not going to work with Russia. We've tried to achieve agreements with them, and the story is always the same. They preserve the ability to escalate, and they escalate whenever they see fit. And so the best way to restore peace is to strip Russia of its ability to escalate. But since this is a very, most likely it's a distant prospect, we need to be moving to this idea in a more strategic way. So we need to be thinking about first keeping Russian fleet as far as possible from Ukrainian shores, and that's something that Ukraine is already doing by developing its missile capabilities and also developing its sea drone capabilities. So if previously they were really close and they were able to fire, and there was even in the beginning of the war there was even a threat of Russian landing in the Odessa Oblast and the Mykolaiv Oblast, so now Ukraine was able to drive them away, but we need to, so the strategy needs to be, first we need to have the capabilities to clear mines and to restore Ukraine's ability to export not only grain and agricultural products, because Ukraine is an export-oriented economy, so we need to be able to export other goods as well. And the sea is the best way to do it, because any land route is it becomes too expensive, right? So sea route is the cheapest one. And we need to increase NATO presence definitely in the region, and we definitely there needs to be a lot of diplomatic efforts talking to countries, because the region is really very different, with countries having different interests and different views, and so it's important to discuss the threats and discuss the common interests, because it's clear that free trade and freedom of navigation is something that's absolutely crucial, and it's in everybody's interest in the region, so we need to focus on that as well.
I mean, so in my mind, it needs to be two strands. First of all, what you all mentioned, further strengthening security and deterrence across the region. But the second strand is speeding up the integration of those countries that are still in the so-called grey zone into the Euro-Atlantic institutions. I mean, obviously in the Western Balkans, you already have a number of countries who are in NATO. In the case of Ukraine and Moldova and hopefully Georgia, their progress towards European EU membership will leap forward in the next few months. But I'd like to come on this topic now to Sasho Kozhusev, and I hope I didn't pronounce that badly as well, who's president of the Balkans Economic Forum. Because as I said at the beginning, the Western Balkans have been in the waiting room now for a long time. There was momentum, then this momentum was lost, now the momentum is gained. How do you see, the real, political will now driving this momentum? Is it something that's really there and really sustainable? And is there also a sort of greater momentum now within the countries themselves to strengthen regional integration between themselves as a way to further strengthen their security?
First of all, I would like to say thank you to Cyprus Forum that invited me to be a speaker at this really exclusive and very nice, very useful, I would say, conference and event. As per your question, the first stabilization and association agreement was signed as a first step towards our enlargement, inclusion in the European Union. It's like 3 decades ago, 30 years. 30 years ago, sorry. So one of the pillars that were imposed to us was that we should start more closely cooperate in economic way and in regional way, meaning that we should enhance our capacities and create a regional economic area that will enable us, that will enrich us, that will prepare us for joining a bigger market. A lot of promises were given to our, I will call it, region or space whatsoever. Many momentums were created, as you mentioned. The new momentum is created now thanks to sorry to say that, but thanks to the Russian aggression on Ukraine. And I'm happy we are happy at the region that now this new French and German proposal was created, which plans two parallel activities. First of all, reform of EU institutions to prepare EU for, let's say, another big round of enlargements planned for 2030 or afterwards. And the other thing is to help Western Balkan countries to reform more quickly and to adjust and to adopt the rules of the game and to become, let's say, prospective members of the EU in very near future. How do I feel? Since the start of this process, the percentage of support of our joining NATO, of the Western Balkans joining NATO were like 95–96% of the people. Throughout the years, this percentage was decreasing, and right now it's like probably 60–70% in different countries. This decrease of support was used by nationalists in our countries to feel and to sell stories to disappointed people and to create bad things in the Balkans. I don't want to get into it. So I would say that it's high time that EU keep its promise to, let's say, have us as EU members in very near future, in a foreseeable future. Of course, there are a lot of more obligations that we have to do. Our homework is not done yet. It's far from being done or perfect, but at least we should, at this moment, starting from now, start working, not started, but continue working together very hard to keep the promise that EU was given to us, and for us to be more able to, let's say, finish or complete our homework, which is not easy task to do. So yes, I'm optimistic. The organization which we created, Association for Regional Development, Balkan Economic Forum, we hope that it will be a platform where relevant stakeholders like from the government, from the private sector, public sector, academia, all relevant key stakeholders will share their messages, will share their suggestions, suggestions how the region can become more developed, how the living standards of the people can be increased, and how we can jointly, at least jointly, move into a better future. Well, thank you for the moment, so hopefully I will have some other issues to discuss. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And just before I come to you, Emil, just bear with me. I would just like to come back to you a second, Ambassador, because obviously Romania has been one of the strongest proponents of further enlargement, not just to the Western Balkans, but in general. So what do you think is going to be the toughest issue for the EU to deal with in their internal discussions? Because I mean, honestly, from the partners' side, I think their task is probably easier than the side of the EU to actually agree. Because you just mentioned this Franco-German paper, but I mean, there was an element in there talking about a multi-speed EU. We don't need a multi-speed EU. We need, everybody going at the same speed because it gives a perception of, different qualities of membership. So what do you think will be the most difficult nut to crack when it comes to, getting member states to do what's necessary to move enlargement forward? Then I'll come to you, Emil.
No, I didn't understand. You said that Romania was an opponent of enlargement.
No, the opposite. One of the strongest supporters, proponent. It means like,
yes.
A flag bearer, right?
Yes, and we are still staying on our position, including not just the Western Balkans, but Moldova is also has to be brought into a European family. And but I personally, and I'm not talking now as an ambassador, I'm talking more as myself as a analyst. This is my previous job. I'm not a career diplomat. I am also a professor of political science. I could tell you that I am very, very skeptical about the future because the political landscape of Europe has dramatically changed, and probably the next European elections, which are scheduled for June next year, will show us that the divisions within the European countries, but also the divisions between the European citizens are very, very growing, are higher than ever. So the agenda probably will be dominated by issues and that will generate various a very complicated political landscape with a lot of anti-European parties in the European Parliament, with the sovereignist movements, with contesting the European bureaucracy, contesting Brussels, contesting I find it tremendous how this debate was evolving. I was one of the first Romanian members of the European Parliament 2005, 2009. So I was the first promotion of Romanian politicians getting into the European Parliament, being first observers, then a full member after 2007 when Romania joined. And I remember the debates we had in the European Parliament. It was about enlargement, it was about Western Balkans, it was about more federalism to Europe. Now I believe the entire project is put under question, and the problem is not enlargement in itself, but reinventing Europe as a project. And this will be probably the challenge for future political generation. Because, and I'm sorry to be so skeptical. As I see it like now, enlargement will remain like somebody said, but it's expression that you can find an unfinished business.
Hopefully it won't be an unfinished business, huh?
Let's keep
for both
optimistic.
the countries and for the EU. But on that, you know, positive or not positive note, I want to move now to Emil Avdaliani, who's director of the Middle East Studies at GeoCase, who is the partner actually for this panel. So I would like to ask you, because you're coming from the South Caucasus, which has always been seen as a sort of bit removed, the other side of the Black Sea, so it doesn't really matter so much. So I'd be interested to hear from you. I mean, how has the EU's approach changed towards the South Caucasus since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in terms of the sort of economic and political cooperation? And also linked to that, obviously, Georgia's much talked about candidate country status. I mean, what do you think is going to be the outcome of this? I mean, we know that the Georgians are struggling to meet all of the criteria for different reasons, but shouldn't it be a geopolitical imperative to integrate Georgia into the EU at this time?
Thank you for this question. Well, I think that we certainly have a much bigger momentum, I would say, behind EU's general approach towards the South Caucasus, Ukraine or Moldova. We see what we didn't really see before 2022. So I think that before the war, the second war of Russia on Ukraine, we didn't really think that Georgia would be getting anything from the EU. And very many people actually were thinking back then, it's only 2 years ago, that Georgia should be moving towards, Georgia should be decreasing its fixation on the West and sort of move towards more multi-vector foreign policy. But the war in itself shifted the narratives dynamic in the wider Black Sea region. And we see, for us, that's the EU expansion, gradual expansion into the Black Sea region. So I think that we are now entering the period when there is no gray zone, and I very much liked what you said, Amanda, in your introduction, that those gray zones are gradually disappearing, I would say. Either Georgia is a pro-Western or EU member state eventually, or it will be moving somewhere else, potentially into not very much likable illiberal or authoritarian camp. So that might not be a decision made by Georgian government or Georgian people, but geopolitics in the region might shift or might force the country into an unknown, I'd say. So I think that if you look from a broader picture, from a historical perspective of what we had before 2022 and what we have now, there is certain progress. And I also share skepticism, or the ambassador mentioned in his speech. But overall, from the South Caucasus, we see that the potential has grown substantially. And we see that EU now has to act geopolitically too. So it's not only about moral values or moral side of the things, but also about who will be controlling the route from Central Asia to the EU, who will be essentially building the so-called middle corridor. And I think that what we've got over the past several weeks in the South Caucasus, and I mean the Nagorno-Karabakh problem, or no longer problem, but essentially the resolution of this conflict, we see that if the EU doesn't really move into the region by giving Georgia candidate status and perhaps later on something more, the EU might not have very good chance in the future to establish itself as a geopolitical actor in this troublesome region, I would say. So now is the time, I think, and some signals are positive coming from Brussels. Perhaps Georgia will be getting candidate status, but with whole range of further conditions or preconditions, whatever you call it. So, but I think, as you rightly said in your question, Manda, that it needs to be addressed as a geopolitical issue too, not only an issue of values or some other things. The EU needs to look at the region from a point of view of connectivity and some other issues which also matter in international relations. So I would say matter more than simply moral issues or values and so on.
Okay, thank you, Emil. I'd like to give the audience a chance now if they have any questions. Yes, sir? I think, is there a microphone there somewhere? Or do you not? Maybe you don't need. Yeah, okay, just go ahead. Yeah, there's one coming.
Thank you for the discussion. I mean, sort of following on the ambassador's skepticism, and also the gentleman from with regard to the Caucasus, there are long-standing issues with regard to ethnic nationalism within the Balkans that have destabilized the region for quite some time, and we're talking about how to bring stability to the region. Perhaps if with the EU absorbing or bringing these countries in, but is there not also a greater possibility that bringing these countries into the EU rather than helping stabilize would further destabilize the EU as they advocate for an EU of nations rather than an EU of states? And, and by destabilizing the EU, diminish the security that the EU might be able to provide to the Balkan region and further the Russian agenda.
Do we have another question? Or okay, I'll let our panelists respond to that. Who would like to? Emil, the ambassador. Yeah.
Well, I think. Well, that's a very pertinent question. I think that. Yeah, that has always been an issue, I think. And perhaps, I mean, from the Georgian perspective, that's the reason, maybe the reason why we have such a slow process of integration into the European Union. Perhaps in Brussels, very many people think that with bringing so many new and distant countries, relatively distant countries, you might see further divisions within the union itself, and that's understandable. How to manage these divisions, these differences, that's, I think, cannot be really done quickly within a year or even within a decade. So that's why I think that what we now have is just the first steps towards further enlargement. So we do not, perhaps we don't need to think of the process as the process which will end, in the near future. And I think that will be the cleverest approach. But just encouraging those countries, showing them that we really need you and we really want you to be with us. That's what Georgia, for example, really wants. So no one is building, no one is having illusions in Tbilisi or across the entire country that we will be EU members in the near future. No, but simply encouragement from Brussels. That's what people really need at the moment. Because otherwise, as you rightly said, the EU might be indeed somehow destabilized from the inside. That's one of the possibilities, negative possibility. But again, perhaps the the solution might be, sort of building a longer-term picture where you will have sort of in 5 or 7, or in 10 years sort of enlargement, but sort of giving concrete dates. And that will help a lot in terms of, making sure progress on relevant issues.
Maybe I can, I was just going to bring Ian back in here. Are you still with us, Ian? Ian? Okay,
Absolutely.
you're still there. Okay, I would like to get your take on this question, because how important is American ongoing support for Euro-Atlantic integration of these countries? And are we going to see this support maintained, from official Washington, or is there a risk it could sort of peter out? Particularly, as we heard a few times earlier today about the US is still the intention of the US to, pivot back again to China as soon as possible. So is the US going to be a reliable partner, let's say, in the medium to longer term? And of course, that would bring us as well to the forthcoming US elections next year. If we see Donald Trump return to the White House, what sort of implications would that actually have for Euro-Atlantic integration, or for Europe, actually for Europe as a whole?
Thank you. Really two sets of questions. They're related in a way. I don't think there's anything. I wouldn't question the fact that the United States is going to continue to be a strong advocate for the Euro-Atlantic integration of countries in the Western Balkans and around the Black Sea. I think it's also true for Turkey, by the way, which is one of the biggest cases in this regard. It's certainly true for Ukraine. There's a lot of American policy invested in those things. Now, the U.S., at the end of the day, doesn't vote in the European Council on these things. And so, in a sense, this is a European decision for Europe to decide, and the politics of this will not be easy. As some of the speakers have already suggested, in the geopolitics, the logic there argues for something rather fast-paced. But the politics of this within the European Union argue for going slower, and sometimes the reform efforts argue maybe for going slower. It may, in fact, in some ways be easier to handle the NATO membership part than the European Union part, because it's not about money in that case or much. It's about other things. When you start to talk about agricultural policy and so on, this rapidly gets very difficult in terms of internal politics in the EU at a time when these are not easy issues. So, but the U.S. will continue to support this. It's in American interest, whatever the administration, I think. The difference will come in terms of the level of U.S. engagement. And there, I could imagine, a Republican administration, not to say a Trump administration, taking a more distant view of this. One of the few things that Republicans and Democrats agree on in Washington these days is a tough attitude towards China. And the situation in strategic terms in the Indo-Pacific is getting more and more difficult and risk-prone. And so there is, I think, a European assumption that this is going to affect American policy over time. But the question is it going to be a fast evolution or a slow one? Europe obviously would like it to be a slow evolution, so that Europe in some sense can backfill the United States in terms of European security. But what if something goes wrong over Taiwan or in the South China Sea next week or next month? And you have a different sort of administration that is less sort of reflexively attached to European security. Those are all risks that one has to think of, and simply at the end of the day on both of these questions simply underscores the fact that these are policy issues for Europe to form and to drive. And the U.S., hopefully, I would hope, will be there to help with that.
Thank you, Ian. I think you wanted to make a comment.
Just 2 minutes, referring to your question. Your question reminded me of a movie I saw when I was a kid. There was a replica, emergency, emergency, get out of the street, the Russians are coming. Let me tell you, Russians are already in the Balkans, very heavily, very much. They invested a lot. They bought a lot of properties in Montenegro. Montenegro owes $1 billion to the Chinese. So Montenegro is heavily indebted. So EU had to do something, some donations to help Montenegro to repay the debt. So it's one big question. The other question is, you know, the presence of Chinese and Russia companies and investors in Serbia. Even in my country, North Macedonia, part of the most important highway was built, has been built. I think now it's stopped. I don't know. I'm not a politician, but has been built with easy money from China, and built by Chinese companies. Russia is not very much present in my country, but in other countries also. So, you know, Republika Srpska and the other. So, thanks to the, let's say, passive approach, or maybe too careful approach by the EU, the Western Balkans is a kind of a black, not black hole, but it's a region that is openly given to these, I would say, alternative players. I'm not a politician, I'm an economist. So the region is already invited in economic terms by these players. Even though the EU and US are the biggest economic supporters and our contributors to our, let's say, higher level, higher living standard level. So these alternative players are here. How to cope with that? If EU proceeds with this very cautious, very slow approach towards the Balkans will be gone. In my country, the nationalism is on the move, is on the rise. In the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. To be honest, I'm fed up. I'm fed up to live in the past. It's 21st century. People are flying rockets to the moon, to other planets, and we are still killing each other. I mean, in other parts of the Balkans. I really hate that. I want to see a Balkans as part of the EU. I want to see Balkans, not in a political terms, united in economic terms. I want to see Balkans which struggles how to improve living standards of the common people, not fighting among each other. That would be my reaction to, or my, let's call it answer to your question. I'm not a politician, I'm not representing EU, but that's what we feel in the Balkans. Thank you.
Thank you, and I agree with every single word that you said. Needs to be a much quicker and a more concerted process in terms of the European integration. But we only have a couple of minutes left, and I don't want to keep people away from their evening meal or cocktails. So I would just like to put very quick questions to the last panelists, because we were talking about other regional actors. We haven't mentioned anything yet about Turkey, which is active basically everywhere. This is probably a topic for a whole entire other panel, right? But maybe quickly, could you all say whether you think Turkey is a positive or a negative influence in the region? I would say there's many positive things to do with Turkey, but I'm the moderator, so I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you for this question. A difficult question indeed, because I think that Turkey plays, a different, well, I would say a game which is not really entirely pro-Western one, but it also doesn't really play a pro-Russian game. So it really does what it really needs at the moment, at a certain period, with certain actors. So it's very pro-Turkish foreign policy that Turkey has. The country has foreign policy potential, economic potential, military potential to do so. And I think that with Turkey, well, the collective West and Brussels, Washington, they will have increasingly difficult times in the future. The longer the war continues in Ukraine, the longer destabilization takes place in the South Caucasus or elsewhere, Turkish foreign policy will be increasingly pragmatic, which means not so much being pro-Western. So I think the EU needs to achieve success on other fronts to have more pro-EU Turkey. So the victory in Ukraine, elsewhere, in other parts of the world where authoritarian powers are sort of trying to reverse the transatlantic unity or liberal global order. I think Turkey will switch, change its foreign policy as it sees fit. But for that, as I said, you need changes in the north of the Black Sea in Ukraine, and that will be a decisive factor. Because from Turkish perspective, Russia hasn't lost the war, and the illiberal movement across Eurasia is not weakening at all. It's increasing in power, and Turkey really wants to play a game which will be relevant to all bigger players, whether it's Russia, China, or the EU itself.
Thank you, Emil. I've just been given the sign that I need to close, but I want to give the last word to you, Julia, if you don't mind. Being a brave and courageous Ukrainian lady, what would be the one thing that you would like the most now from the international partners? If you could say one thing, what's really crucial at this time for Ukraine?
Well, it's a very banal answer: weapons.
I knew you were going to say that. Weapons.
I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. I mean, we did not start this war. We don't want this war, but there is no other way to end it.
Okay, so weapons, we need more weapons. So with that, I need to close this discussion. I'm sorry that we couldn't go on because actually all of these issues require a lot of analysis and a deep delve. So we had a lot of topics in one panel. So thank you to all of you. You were all brilliant. Thanks to you, Ian, for joining us online, and thanks to the audience for staying with us at this very hot time of day. I really appreciate it. And only one word to say now: Slava Ukraini. Thank you.